Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I'm a forensic pathologist working at the county coroner's office in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. You can call me Dr. Sella Wren if you prefer, though most people in the office simply call me Doc during my 15 years there. I've performed over 3,000 autopsies in my career. I've seen every conceivable cause of death: murders, suicides, accidents, natural causes, overdoses, and trauma that would make most people sick to their stomach. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, and ultimately changed how I view my profession entirely. The Lancaster County Coroner's Office is a modern facility built in 2008 that serves a population of approximately 550,000 people. We handle approximately 1,200 deaths per year, with about 400 requiring full autopsy examinations. I work primarily day shifts, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., because I prefer the consistency and the ability to work closely with law enforcement and insurance investigators during normal business hours. The case that still haunts me began on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. It was shaping up to be a routine day. I had 2 natural death cases scheduled for autopsy and 1 pending accident case from the weekend. I had been in the office since 7:30 a.m. reviewing files and preparing my instruments when my supervisor, Dr. Graham Beckett, knocked on the autopsy suite door around 9:15 a.m. "Sella, we've got an insurance exhumation coming in this afternoon," he said, holding a thick manila folder. "The family is requesting an independent autopsy for a life insurance claim." Exhumations aren't uncommon in forensic pathology. Insurance companies sometimes dispute payouts, families question causes of death, or new evidence emerges months or even years after burial. Usually they're straightforward cases. We examine the remains, confirm or correct the original findings, write our report, and everyone moves on with their lives. "What's the background?" I asked, pulling off my latex gloves from the morning's first autopsy. A 58-year-old man named Robert James Henley, retired state government worker, worked in the Department of Transportation for 32 years, died 6 months ago on September 18th during a family dinner at his home. Wife found him collapsed in the bathroom around 8:30 p.m. EMTs responded within 12 minutes, but he was already deceased when they arrived. Apparent cardiac arrest. Dr. Beckett handed me the folder, which was unusually thick for a routine death case. The original autopsy was performed by Dr. Kevin Walsh, a temporary pathologist who was covering for Dr. Rodriguez while he was on medical leave. Walsh ruled it a natural death from myocardial infarction. I flipped through the paperwork. Robert Henley had been married to Patricia Henley for 34 years. They had 2 adult children, Michael, 32, and Jennifer, 29. No significant medical history beyond mild hypertension and elevated cholesterol, both controlled with medication. Non-smoker, occasional social drinker, no illicit drug use. The family had chosen Eternal Rest Funeral Home for the services, and burial took place at Greenwood Cemetery just 2 days after death. "So what's the insurance company's concern?" I asked. Metropolitan Life Insurance is balking at paying out the policy. It's a substantial claim, $750,000 in life insurance plus an additional $500,000 in accidental death benefits that the widow is claiming. They think there might be fraud involved, or at minimum, they want verification that the death was actually from natural causes, as stated in the original autopsy report. That caught my attention. Accidental death benefits on top of life insurance suggested the family believed something other than a heart attack had killed Robert Henley. What's the basis for the accidental death claim? According to the widow's attorney, she believes her husband may have been poisoned or suffered some kind of adverse reaction to medication that caused the cardiac arrest. She's claiming it wasn't a natural death. I spent the next hour reviewing the original autopsy report and death certificate. Dr. Kevin Walsh had performed what appeared to be a thorough examination. documenting external findings, internal organ examination, and tissue samples for histological analysis. His conclusion was straightforward: death due to acute myocardial infarction due to coronary artery disease. Manner of death, natural. But as I read through Walsh's notes more carefully, I began to notice some inconsistencies. The external examination mentioned unremarkable lividity patterns, but didn't provide specifics about the distribution or intensity of livor mortis. The internal examination described moderate coronary artery disease, but didn't quantify the percentage of blockage in specific vessels. Most concerning was a brief notation about unusual postural lividity that wasn't explained elsewhere in the report. "Dr. Beckett," I called from my office. "Do we have contact information for Dr. Walsh? I'd like to discuss some aspects of the original examination with him." "That's going to be a problem," Beckett replied, walking over to my desk. "Walsh finished his temporary assignment here and moved on. His contract was only for 6 weeks, while Rodriguez recovered from his surgery. We don't have any forwarding contact information for him." That struck me as unusual. Medical professionals, especially pathologists, typically maintain professional relationships and contact networks, even when taking temporary positions. Most hospitals and coroner's offices keep detailed records of consulting physicians for exactly these kinds of follow-up situations. What about his medical license? The state board should have current contact information. I already checked. His license is valid and current, but the address on file is a P.O. box in Philadelphia. I tried calling the number they have on record, but it's been disconnected. The exhumation was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Greenwood Cemetery. By the time I arrived at the site, representatives from Metropolitan Life Insurance, the Henley family's attorney, and the funeral director were already present. Patricia Henley stood about 30 feet away from the gravesite with her 2 adult children, all of them looking somber and anxious. I had performed dozens of exhumations over my career, but they never became routine. There's something deeply unsettling about disturbing the dead, even when it's medically and legally necessary. The cemetery workers had already located the grave using ground-penetrating radar and had begun the excavation process using a small backhoe. As we waited for the casket to be exposed, I spoke with Patricia Henley's attorney, Simon Dandridge, about the family's concerns. "Mr. Henley has never believed her husband died of natural causes," Simon explained. "Robert was in excellent health for his age. He exercised regularly, watched his diet, and took his medications as prescribed. He had seen his cardiologist just 3 months before his death, and his stress test results were normal." "What makes the family suspect something other than a heart attack?" I asked. Simon glanced over at Patricia Henley, who was crying softly while her daughter held her arm. The circumstances of his death were unusual. During dinner that night, Robert complained of feeling dizzy and nauseous. He went to the bathroom and was found collapsed about 10 minutes later. But here's the thing. He didn't show any of the classic signs of a heart attack. No chest pain, no shortness of breath, no sweating. Just sudden onset of dizziness and nausea, then collapse. That wasn't necessarily suspicious. Heart attacks can present atypically, especially in older patients, but combined with the insurance company's concerns and the gaps in the original autopsy report, it warranted closer examination. The cemetery workers finished the excavation around 3:30 p.m. The casket was a mid-range model made of brushed steel with brass fixtures, nothing fancy but solid construction. As they lifted it from the grave using a mechanical hoist, I noticed what appeared to be scratches on the exterior surface, particularly around the latch mechanism. "Those scratches look fresh," I commented to Simon. The funeral director, a thin man named David Peterson, who had handled the original burial, frowned as he examined the markings. "Those definitely weren't there when we buried Mr. Henley. The casket was in perfect condition." We transported the casket back to our facility in the coroner's van. By the time we had it positioned in Autopsy Suite 2, it was nearly 5 p.m. I decided to begin the examination immediately, rather than wait until the following morning. exhumed remains can deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air after months in the ground. I began by photographing the exterior of the casket from multiple angles, documenting the scratches and any other anomalies. The scratches were indeed concerning. They appeared to be gouges made from the inside, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. When I opened the casket, Robert Henley's remains were remarkably well preserved. The embalming had been thorough, and the sealed casket had protected the body from most environmental factors. He was dressed in a dark blue suit with a white shirt and burgundy tie. His hands were folded across his chest in the traditional funeral position. But as I began my external examination, I immediately noticed findings that contradicted everything in Dr. Walsh's original report. The fingernails on both hands were broken and torn. Several nails were missing entirely, and dried blood was visible under the remaining ones. I carefully scraped material from under each nail and collected it for analysis. The samples contained wood fibers and what appeared to be fabric fragments consistent with casket lining. The palms of both hands showed abrasions and lacerations that had partially healed, indicating they occurred shortly before death. More disturbing, there were defensive-type wounds on the backs of his hands and forearms, scratches and cuts that suggested he had been trying to protect himself from something. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered to myself as I continued the examination. Around the wrists, I found faint but distinct marks that looked like ligature patterns. The discoloration was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had bound Robert Henley's wrists at some point before his death. Similar marks were present on his ankles. I called Dr. Beckett into the autopsy suite. "Robert, I need you to see this. We may be looking at a homicide case." Dr. Beckett examined the findings with a magnifying glass and agreed that the marks were highly suspicious. "Sella, these injuries are completely inconsistent with a cardiac death. Dr. Walsh should have documented all of this in his original report." I continued the external examination and found additional concerning evidence. There were contusions on the back of Henley's head that had been hidden by his hair during the original autopsy. The bruising pattern suggested blunt force trauma, possibly from being struck with a heavy object or from his head impacting a hard surface during a struggle. Most disturbing of all, when I examined the interior of the casket more closely, I found scratch marks on the inner surface of the lid. Deep gouges in the satin lining, torn fabric, and what appeared to be dried blood on the metal underneath. The scratches formed a desperate, chaotic pattern, exactly what you would expect from someone trying to claw their way out of a confined space. "Dr. Beckett," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think Robert Henley was buried alive." The internal autopsy confirmed my worst fears. When I opened the chest cavity, the lungs showed clear signs of asphyxiation, petechial hemorrhages throughout the tissue, and fluid accumulation in the alveoli consistent with suffocation. The heart appeared completely normal with only mild coronary artery disease, nowhere near enough to cause sudden cardiac death. But the most shocking discovery came when I examined tissue samples under the microscope. The injuries I had observed externally showed clear signs of vital reaction. The cellular structure around the wounds indicated active bleeding and inflammatory response, proof that the injuries had occurred while the heart was still beating and blood was still circulating. These injuries had happened while Robert Henley was alive. I worked until nearly midnight, documenting every finding and collecting tissue samples for comprehensive toxicological analysis. The evidence was overwhelming. This was not a natural death from cardiac arrest. Robert Henley had been restrained, possibly beaten, and then buried while still alive. The next morning, I met with Dr. Beckett and Detective Ray Morrison from the County Police Department. I presented my findings with detailed photographs and preliminary tissue analysis results. "So you're telling me that Dr. Walsh either completely missed all of these obvious signs of trauma, or he deliberately covered them up?" Detective Morrison asked. "The evidence speaks for itself," I replied. "Either Dr. Walsh performed the most negligent autopsy I've ever seen, or he was complicit in covering up a murder." Dr. Beckett leaned back in his chair, looking troubled. "Sella, This puts us in a challenging position. If Walsh was deliberately falsifying autopsy reports, it calls into question every case he handled during his time here. Detective Morrison opened his notebook. How many cases did Walsh handle while he was working here? "Let me check the records," Dr. Beckett said, pulling up files on his computer. According to our database, Walsh performed 17 autopsies during his 6-week assignment. Most were routine natural deaths, but there were a few that might warrant review. I spent the rest of the day going through Walsh's case files. What I found was deeply disturbing. In case after case, Walsh had performed cursory examinations and reached conclusions that seemed hasty or inadequately supported by the evidence described in his notes. A 45-year-old woman found dead in her apartment. Walsh ruled it a stroke, but his notes mentioned unexplained contusions on the neck that weren't investigated further. A 62-year-old man who collapsed at a restaurant ruled a heart attack, but toxicology screening was never performed despite the family's report that he had been acting strangely before his collapse. A 39-year-old woman found dead in her car ruled an aneurysm, but Walsh's notes indicated possible blunt force trauma to the skull that wasn't followed up. "Detective Morrison," I called from my office. "I think we have a much bigger problem than just the Henley case." Detective Morrison came over and reviewed the files I had compiled. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read through Walsh's reports. "This is either gross negligence or a deliberate pattern of covering up suspicious deaths. Either way, we need to track down Dr. Walsh immediately." The investigation into Dr. Walsh's background revealed disturbing information. While his medical license was legitimate, his employment history showed a pattern of short-term assignments at hospitals and coroner's offices across multiple states. In each location, he worked for only a few weeks or months before moving on to the next position. More concerning, Detective Morrison discovered that in several of the jurisdictions where Walsh had worked, there had been subsequent questions raised about cases he had handled. In Colorado, a family had requested an independent autopsy after Walsh ruled their loved one's death natural, and the second examination revealed evidence of poisoning. In Florida, Walsh had handled 3 cases that were later reclassified as homicides after other pathologists reviewed his work. "This guy is either the most incompetent pathologist in the country, or he's deliberately covering up murders," Detective Morrison said during one of our meetings. "And given the pattern, I'm leaning toward the latter." The toxicology results from Robert Henley's tissue samples came back 2 weeks later, and they provided the final piece of the puzzle. The analysis revealed traces of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic drug used in surgical anesthesia. In therapeutic doses, the drug paralyzes muscles while leaving the patient conscious. In higher doses, it can cause complete paralysis, including respiratory muscles, leading to suffocation. Most significantly, succinylcholine has a very short half-life in living tissue, which is why it wasn't detected in the original examination. However, traces of the drug and its metabolites can remain in bone marrow and other deep tissues for months after death. "Someone injected Robert Henley with a paralytic drug," I explained to Detective Morrison and Dr. Beckett. "The drug would have caused complete paralysis while leaving him fully conscious and aware. He would have appeared dead to anyone who didn't perform a thorough examination, but he would have been fully alert and terrified." The implications were horrifying. Robert Henley had been paralyzed with a medical drug, then pronounced dead and prepared for burial, while still alive and conscious. He had spent his final hours trapped in a coffin, unable to move or scream, slowly suffocating while fully aware of his situation. "But how would someone get access to succinylcholine?" Detective Morrison asked. "That's not something you can buy at a pharmacy." "It's a controlled substance used in hospitals and surgical centers," I explained. "Someone with medical knowledge and access to surgical supplies could obtain it, or ... I paused, considering the implications. Someone like Dr. Walsh could have provided it. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI became involved when Detective Morrison's research revealed that Walsh had worked in 7 different states over the past 3 years. A task force was formed to review suspicious deaths in each jurisdiction where Walsh had been employed. What they found was a nationwide pattern of murders disguised as natural deaths. In case after case, Walsh had performed inadequate autopsies on victims who showed subtle signs of foul play. The victims were typically middle-aged or older individuals with substantial life insurance policies. In most cases, the beneficiaries were spouses or adult children who had pushed for quick burial without extensive investigation. But the investigation hit a major obstacle when detectives tried to locate Dr. Walsh. His last known address was a motel room in Philadelphia that he had vacated 2 weeks before the Henley exhumation. His medical license was still active, but the contact information on file led to dead ends. His social security number had been used to open bank accounts that were quickly emptied and closed. "It's like he vanished into thin air," Detective Morrison told me during one of our meetings. "We've put out a nationwide BOLO, but this guy knows how to stay off the radar." The most disturbing discovery came when federal investigators started looking into Walsh's true identity. The fingerprints on file with his medical license didn't match any criminal records, but they also didn't match the prints associated with his supposed educational background. When investigators contacted the medical school that had allegedly granted his degree, they found no record of anyone named Kevin Walsh in their graduation records. Dr. Walsh was a complete fabrication, a false identity created by someone with extensive knowledge of the medical system and access to official documentation. 3 months into the investigation, the task force had identified at least 23 suspicious deaths across 7 states that showed the same pattern. Inadequate autopsies, rapid burial, substantial insurance payouts, and the involvement of Dr. Kevin Walsh or similar false identities. The case broke open when investigators in Arizona found a storage unit rented under one of Walsh's aliases. Inside, they discovered medical equipment, including vials of succinylcholine, syringes, and detailed files on dozens of potential victims. The files contained personal information, insurance policy details, and what appeared to be surveillance notes on daily routines and vulnerabilities. Most chilling of all, they found a journal written in Walsh's handwriting that described his methods in clinical detail. He had been operating as a contract killer for hire, using his false medical credentials to gain access to coroners' offices, where he could cover up murders committed by others or commit them himself using untraceable methods. The journal revealed that the Henley case had been a contract killing. Patricia Henley's adult son, Michael, had been deeply in debt due to gambling problems and had arranged for his father's murder to collect the insurance money. Michael had contacted Walsh through dark web channels used by criminals to arrange untraceable murders. When investigators arrested Michael Henley, he initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed when presented with evidence from Walsh's journal. He admitted to meeting with Walsh 2 weeks before his father's death to discuss the plan and payment. On the night of the murder, Michael had invited his parents to dinner and then injected his father with the paralytic drug when he went to the bathroom. Robert Henley had collapsed immediately, but remained conscious and aware. Michael waited 10 minutes before discovering his father and calling 911, ensuring that paramedics would find no signs of life. Walsh, who was already working at our coroner's office under his false identity, performed the autopsy and ruled the death natural. The plan was perfect, Michael told detectives during his confession. Dad would be buried quickly, the insurance would pay out, and no one would ever question a routine heart attack death in a 58-year-old man with high blood pressure. The only flaw in their plan was the insurance company's decision to request an independent autopsy 6 months later. Patricia Henley was devastated when she learned that her own son had murdered her husband in such a horrific way. She had genuinely believed her husband might have been accidentally poisoned or had suffered an adverse drug reaction. She never suspected that her child had deliberately paralyzed his father and left him to suffocate in a coffin. The case against Michael Henley resulted in a conviction for first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Several co-conspirators in other states were also arrested and convicted as the investigation expanded. But Dr. Kevin Walsh was never found. Despite an extensive nationwide manhunt, he managed to disappear completely. Investigators believe he fled to a country without extradition treaties with the United States, where he could continue operating under new false identities. The investigation ultimately identified 47 suspicious deaths across 12 states that were linked to Walsh or similar fake medical professionals. In cases where exhumation was possible, the remains showed evidence of foul play that had been covered up by inadequate autopsies. Dozens of families learned that their loved ones had been murdered, often by people they trusted. The case changed how I approach every autopsy I perform. I now spend additional time on external examinations, looking for subtle signs of trauma that might be overlooked in a cursory inspection. I perform more comprehensive toxicology testing, even in cases that appear to be natural deaths. And I maintain detailed photographic documentation of every finding, no matter how minor it might seem. Most importantly, I've become an advocate for stricter credentialing and background checks for temporary medical professionals. The ease with which Walsh was able to create false identities and gain access to sensitive positions in the medical system represents a serious vulnerability that could be exploited by other criminals. But the aspect of this case that haunts me the most isn't the criminal conspiracy or the systematic cover-up of murders. It's the realization of how many people might be buried alive without anyone ever knowing it. Robert Henley's case was discovered only because an insurance company pushed for a second opinion. How many other families accepted natural death rulings without question? How many other Dr. Walshes are out there, moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, covering up murders or committing them directly? Every time I perform an autopsy now, I think about Robert Henley clawing at the inside of his coffin. I imagine him lying there in complete darkness, paralyzed but fully conscious, realizing that he had been betrayed by his own son and condemned to a slow, horrifying death. The medical examiner community has implemented new protocols partly as a result of this case. Temporary pathologists now undergo more extensive background checks. Unusual patterns in cause-of-death determinations are flagged for review, and coroners' offices are required to maintain better records and contact information for all consulting physicians. But I know these measures aren't foolproof. Determined criminals with medical knowledge can still exploit weaknesses in the system. And somewhere out there, the man who called himself Dr. Kevin Walsh is probably creating new false identities and continuing his deadly work. I've started keeping a database of suspicious cases that I come across in medical literature and news reports. Deaths that were processed too quickly, autopsies that seem inadequate, and patterns of unusual mortality in specific locations or time periods. It's become an obsession, but I feel like I owe it to Robert Henley and all the other victims to keep looking for signs of similar crimes. Last month, I was contacted by a pathologist in Oregon who had concerns about several cases handled by a temporary colleague who had recently left their office. The circumstances sounded disturbingly familiar: rushed autopsies, missing documentation, and a consulting pathologist who had vanished without leaving forwarding contact information. I'm planning to fly to Oregon next month to consult on potential exhumations. The Robert Henley case taught me that death is not always what it appears to be, and that the people we trust to determine the truth about death can sometimes be the ones working hardest to conceal it. Every autopsy I perform now carries the weight of that knowledge. The understanding that my findings might be the only chance for justice for someone who died in fear and pain. But more than anything, the case haunts me because of a simple, terrible truth. Robert Henley's death was discovered only by accident. If the insurance company hadn't pushed for a second autopsy, if I hadn't been thorough in my examination, if any number of small details had gone differently, his murder would have remained a perfect crime. And that makes me wonder, how many perfect crimes are buried in cemeteries across the country? How many people are lying in graves right now? People who were murdered by family members or criminals. People whose deaths were covered up by corrupt medical professionals. People who trusted the system to protect them and were betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The dead can't speak for themselves. That's supposed to be our job as forensic pathologists, to give voice to the voiceless, to find the truth about how and why people died. But the Henley case showed me that sometimes the people who are supposed to speak for the dead are the ones working hardest to keep them silent. I don't sleep as well as I used to. Every night, I think about scratches on coffin lids, about people waking up in complete darkness, about the sound that no one will ever hear, the desperate, muffled attempts to scream of someone buried alive. And I wonder how many are down there right now, in cemeteries across the country, people who trusted doctors and medical examiners to determine whether they were really dead, people who weren't.